Now, the SNP has accused the Prime Minister of misleading voters during the referendum campaign when he argued that a vote to remain in the UK would benefit Scotland's green energy industry. It's the latest stage of a row that began on Wednesday when it was announced that subsidies for new onshore wind farms will end a year earlier than expected. The industry body Scottish Renewables said that could cost Scotland jobs and £3 billion worth of investment. Natalie Higgins reports.
Turbines generate green, clean energy and a good bit of controversy too. The subsidy scheme is funded by charges on household fuel bills. But from April next year, energy companies will have to do without that incentive. The UK government says they were given fair warning.
This can't come as a huge surprise to those sort of companies. The Prime Minister said that we would be bringing forward ending onshore wind subsidies last year. Former Conservative ministers in this department said so several times this year. It was in the manifesto. We're delivering on that mandate.
David Cameron once said his coalition with the Lib Dems would be the greenest government ever. Now, a blue majority is giving communities in England and Wales the final say over new wind farms in their area. And the government says there are now enough onshore wind projects to meet its renewable energy targets. But there are another 3,000 planned for the UK, and 70% of them are in Scotland. There's anger here at the lack of consultation.
This decision is wrong-headed, it is perverse and it is downright outrageous. I think it severely undermines any Tory claims to be pro-business. Scottish Renewables estimate that Scotland could lose £3 billion of investment because of this decision. Scottish Power estimate that ending onshore wind support could cost consumers £2 to £3 billion, as more expensive generation will be required instead.
The Scottish Government's warned that the decision could be challenged by a judicial review, and it's vowed to do all it can to force a rethink.
Well, I'm joined from Muffet by the Secretary of State for Scotland, David Mendell. Well, look, first of all, this move to remove subsidies quicker than expected is deeply unconservative, isn't it? Because isn't it a basic principle that people who sink investment funds into creating projects should not retrospectively have that changed? And people have sunk money into planning for wind farms in the reasonable expectation that government policy would continue as it is for a few more years, and then you suddenly hit them with this.
Good morning, Gordon. I don't think it should come as a surprise at all to business, the line that the government's taking. The Conservatives have made it very clear for a long time that we didn't believe that the continuation of the onshore subsidy could be justified. We made it clear in our manifesto. Indeed, it was on the very front cover of my own election address. So I don't think it's a surprise. What business has to do all the time is make judgments in relation to the predictability of government policy. It does that when it makes investment decisions. But what we've made very clear is that those wind farms which are actually online, which have got planning permission, which have got grid connections, which land has been bought, they'll still go ahead. So businesses who've made a significant investment will still see that investment come to fruition. But those wind farms which are not in that position won't go ahead.
But it's not just the renewables companies who are making the point I made to you. Let me read you something that was said by the CBI. Katia Hall, the Deputy Director General, says, quote, "Cutting the renewables obligation scheme early sends a worrying signal about the stability of the UK's energy policy framework. This is a blow not just to the industry and could damage our reputation as a good place to invest in energy infrastructure."
I don't accept that analysis at all. What's clear is that the UK, for example, is regarded as the #1 place to invest for offshore wind. It's one of the leading places in the world to invest for marine energy. So the UK is regarded as clearly as a good investment location in relation to evolving technologies. But wind onshore is an old technology. The debate has been well evidenced. Okay. The debate has been had, and I don't think that it should come as a surprise to any business at all that this decision was going to be taken. We have 70% of the UK
David Cameron
wind farms here in Scotland.
David Cameron is proposing that communities in England and Wales should have a right of veto over future wind farm proposals. Do you think the Scottish Government should give communities in Scotland the same power?
I absolutely support that proposal for Scotland because, as I was about to say, we have 70% of the UK's wind farms. We've reached saturation level, and in areas here like the south of Scotland, the pattern has been local councils and local people have opposed significant developments, only to find them overturned by the Scottish Government's planning regime. I believe that local people should have the final say on these developments, and I think it's very ironic that the Scottish Government take a completely different view in relation to fracking, which they say that local people should be able to stop. But in relation to wind onshore, they believe that they should be able to routinely override the wishes of local people.
Right. So presumably for the sake of consistency, you also believe that local communities in Scotland should have a right to veto fracking proposals?
I absolutely do believe that, and I believe that that should have been the policy in relation to wind. I think our position is consistent in relation to standing up for local communities. If the Scottish Government is so keen to listen to business in relation to every single issue, they're certainly not listening to business in relation to fracking, having taken an arbitrary decision to ban it.
All right. The Scottish Government has threatened a judicial review of Amber Rudd's decision. Do you think they can go ahead with that?
That's a matter for them. I'm confident that the decision has been made following the proper and due process. If anyone feels that it has not been, then obviously in this country we do have the right of legal review. But I think the decision has been made on the right grounds. We've reached the level of onshore wind that needed to be subject to subsidy. We've got a track to the target that we want in terms of 2020, in terms of the 30% of energy, electricity energy being generated by renewables. So we're on track with that target. I don't think the decision would be changed by judicial review, but of course we have a democratic and law-abiding system, and if others want to challenge that, then obviously they can do so.
Can I just ask you for clarification on something you said in answer to my first question? You said that there would be a grace period, but I'm not clear what the grace period is for. Is it only for projects which have planning permission already and which also have the land and have bought the land? Is that the only criterion? So anything that's not been given planning consent already will not get the subsidy?
They will need also to have the grid connection. There'll be decisions to be made.
Let me just pick you up on that.
There'll be decisions to be made as to exactly where all these processes are and what can be regarded
but
as
I want to be clear on this.
As permission having been granted, or land ownership, or the grid connection. And there are various certification procedures which have been announced by the government as to what will determine whether those things have taken place.
I want to be clear on this, because this is an important point. So if you already have purchased land and you already have planning permission for a wind farm, but you do not already have grid connection, then from what you're saying, you will not, even though you have planning permission, be eligible for subsidy.
You will need to demonstrate what the situation is in relation to the grid connection. But if you have no prospect of a grid connection, then you're not going to be able to receive subsidy.
Right. So in other words, wind farms which already have planning permission could be affected by this?
Wind farms that have no prospect of receiving a grid connection will probably be affected by it. I mean, it will be a determination in respect of each individual wind farm, but it will be whether there is any prospect of a grid connection being delivered.
All right, David Mendell, Luke, thank you very much indeed for joining us. And listening to that is the Minister for Energy, Fergus Ewing, who's here in the studio. Well, let's get on to some of the detail in a moment. But first of all, if this goes ahead, can Scotland meet its carbon emissions targets?
I think it will be very challenging to meet the 2020 target of renewables, of delivering 100% green energy by 2000. I think it will be difficult, and I'll be quite candid about that.
Let's be clear on this, because the Scottish Government, you've missed the target 4 years in a row, but the Scottish Government's always said, well, OK, but the special factors, base calculations have changed. We will meet the 2020 target, but you're now saying you might not do that. I
think it'll be extremely difficult, and that's absolutely disappointing. And in the backdrop of actually achieving our interim target, Gordon, of delivering 50% of our electricity from green resources now, but meeting the 2020 target will be extremely challenging. And I think, you know, where I would challenge David in a couple of respects is that the Tory manifesto said, yes, we're going to stop new subsidies for onshore wind, but they said nothing about the existing subsidy regime. And secondly, David has said nothing about what the UK government proposed with regard to EMR, the contracts for difference, the new system that's coming in. But the hints are that that too will see either an elimination or a substantial reduction of support for onshore wind. Now, the Scottish Government are determined to pursue renewables of all sorts, including hydro, tidal, offshore. Okay. But it is a fact that the least expensive, Gordon, at the moment of large-scale electricity is onshore. And that's why the CBI and many individual companies, whom I met just on Friday, are now starting very seriously to talk about investing in other countries than the UK.
Judicial review. Will you, or indeed can you, as a government, institute a judicial review procedure?
Well, we have no proposals to conduct a judicial review. The argument that I put forward is that because that the Conservative government's decision to cease the ROCs regime 1 year early, as you pointed out, Gordon, after a huge amount of sunk investment, not just by companies, but by communities as well, for community schemes, because that appears irrational, because they're scrapping the least expensive means of achieving their targets.
Just to cut to the chase on this, are you saying that it would have to be renewable wind companies or landowners who are directly affected who would have to apply for judicial review?
Well, they will have the direct commercial interest, so I think it is for them and possibly for consumers, because...
But not for the Scottish Government?
We have no plans to conduct a judicial review.
Do you have any power? Well, it's not a question of conduct. You would have presumably to go to the High Court in London.
Well, we could do, but we have no plans to do so. But could I just raise another point? That I discussed the issue in general terms with a number of developers, and I think their view is that they need to know what the long-term future is for renewables in the UK, because we believe that the decision that the UK government told us about, I mean, there was no proper consultation in any meaningful sense, is wrong and ill-advised and irrational. But also, they haven't yet clarified what is the long-term future. Are they going to have a 2030 decarbonisation target? Is onshore wind going to play a part? Now, if the answer to that is no, then, of course, a lot of companies will at that point, I think, begin seriously to contemplate a judicial review action.
David Cameron is proposing that communities in England and Wales will have a power of veto over new wind farm developments. Will you legislate so that local communities in Scotland have such powers?
Well, we don't think that that's part of the planning system, north or south of the border. What you're postulating here is a sort of local referenda. But
it's not what I'm postulating, it's what the Prime Minister is postulating.
Well, you're asking me about it, and fair enough. But what I would say, Gordon, is that the most recent evidence of opinion throughout Scotland is that 71% of people in Scotland not only support onshore wind, but think there should be more of it, and that's up from 64% a year ago. So whilst I accept that some people watching this programme will be very strongly opposed, Scotland as a whole recognises that we are, if you like, the green powerhouse of the UK.
So your answer to my question, will you give local communities in Scotland the right of veto in the way that local communities in England and Wales will have, is no, you won't?
Well, we don't propose local referenda on planning decisions. We think the existing planning system allows people's views to be heard.
But you see, only this week, the Scottish Parliament passed your community empowerment bill amidst grand hoo-ha-ha about how this was empowering local communities to take decisions on issues that affect them. And here we are only a few days later. It's the Prime Minister of Great Britain, not the Scottish Government, which is proposing to empower communities. And you're telling me, despite your community empowerment bill, that you will not give local communities the final say on an issue which, as you know perfectly well, many communities up and down Scotland feel very, very strongly about, either pro or anti.
Well, I don't accept the thesis that local communities have no say or are cut out. And incidentally, David Mendell said that the Scottish Government overrules all local decisions. The facts are, Gordon, I checked this just before coming onto the programme, that in 60% of the cases, appeals by developers unsuccessful at local level were rejected by the Reporters Unit, which in any event is an independent planning unit. But I'll tell you this.
Fine,
that
you're talking about local authority procedures. The whole point about community empowerment is that local people make these decisions. Now, if David Cameron can do it for people in England, can't you do it for Scotland?
Well, local authorities are elected locally by people and they make decisions. And what I'm saying is that in the majority of cases, a very substantial majority, the decision taken by the independent Scottish Government reporter upholds the local authority decisions. That contradicts flatly what David said, but could I just point out it's absolutely relevant that communities will be very disappointed because the decision that Amber Rudd has taken will mean that they will not get enormous benefit for their communities throughout Scotland, which is worth £8 million a year to communities
We're
throughout
running
the
out
land.
of time, and I did want to... I mean, you've said that you think it's going to be extremely difficult to meet the carbon emission targets for 2020. What about the Bewley-Denny line? There are suggestions that the viability of that is now in question.
Well, I don't... I'm aware of a single report. I don't think that is correct. And perhaps I could point out that the Bewley-Denny project was conceived not as a project for Scotland alone, but to enable export of Scotland's renewable energy down south to help them keep the lights on and maintain security of supply. So I don't think that was pointed out in the particular story.
Very briefly,
Gordon.
The next big thing, I mean, the SNP, particularly Alex Salmond, made a great thing about offshore wind and how it wouldn't just provide renewable energy, but a new industry for Scotland. Well, just this week, there's the world's first ever floating offshore array is planned in Scotland, and the contracts for building it went to a Spanish shipyard. Are you disappointed that more of the work for this new offshore development is not actually happening in Scotland and is not creating the kind of industry that was hoped for?
Well, Scotland has deeper waters, and therefore if we can have floating offshore turbines, then we remove the extra costs that we have through developing what is the best offshore resource in Europe. And therefore we are supported in principle. You're absolutely right. We're disappointed that the contract did not go to a Scottish yard. However, I understand that there is a further substantial contract which we are considering with the particular developer, which we hope will come to Scotland, along with a very substantial proportion of the other spend on maintenance and other work in that contract.
OK, we'll have to leave it there. Fergus Ewing, thank you very much indeed. Now, Lord Faulkner, who was Secretary of State for